Hello and welcome. Whether you're a regular listener or joining for the first time, I'm glad you're here. My name is Peter Doherty. I'm a Catholic priest and a psychologist with a particular interest in the relationship between psychology and spirituality. These two fields have often viewed one another with suspicion. Yet, in reality, they are deeply complementary. Sound psychological insight can strengthen our spiritual life, while authentic spirituality, grounded in psychological well-being, can deepen meaning, resilience, and daily functioning. This podcast reflects on the Gospel readings for the coming week. It is intended as a resource for those preparing homilies and sermons, as well as anyone who teaches, studies, or simply wishes to engage more deeply with Scripture. Drawing on psychological research, biblical scholarship, and anthropological studies, I aim to make the Gospels both accessible and relevant. I also approach Scripture as a guide for faith and human development, recognizing that biblical authors wrote with a worldview different from our own, offering rich and layered insights into identity, suffering, and hope. Today's reflection is based on Matthew chapter 10, verse 26 to 33. Which will be proclaimed in churches on June 21st, 2026. In this passage, Jesus speaks directly about fear. This is not a new theme in the Christian tradition, nor in this podcast. I have explored it previously, and I encourage listeners to revisit the episode from June 16th, 2024 for additional background insights. In this reflection, I will consider both fear and anxiety, given the significant overlap between these experiences. The early Christian community lived with significant fear of rejection, persecution, and uncertainty about God's presence in their suffering. That experience remains familiar today. While Scripture frequently refers to the fear of the Lord, it's noteworthy that this exact expression does not appear in the Gospels. Traditionally, it has been understood as reverence rather than terror or fear. I remember even as a child, I recall questioning this language. Why speak of fear when reverence seems clearer? That tension highlights how easily fear can be misunderstood in both faith and life. From a psychological perspective, fear is often at the root of many human struggles. It can manifest as pride, driven by fear of insignificance or weakness, as anger or violence, rooted in perceived threat or humiliation, as deceit, arising from fear of exposure or rejection, and even in the forms of sexual behavior that attempt to compensate for loneliness or inadequacy. Recognizing fear beneath these patterns can be important, particularly when we are trying to understand or to forgive others. Fear itself is not inherently negative. It's a normal and adaptive response that helps us respond to real danger. However, it becomes problematic when it is persistent, disproportionate, or disconnected from an actual threat. In such cases, fear can impair functioning, contribute to anxiety and depression, disrupt relationships, and hinder decision-making. Psychological models suggest that fear develops through conditioning, observation, information, and cognitive interpretation. In contemporary society, anxiety is widespread. Pharmacologically, medications such as benzodiazepines are among the most commonly prescribed treatments globally. At a behavioral level, when people do not feel safe, they often restrict their lives in order to maintain a sense of control and protection. In my own teaching, I've asked students to rate how safe they feel on a scale of 1 to 10. Interestingly, the average response is often around 8, suggesting that even in relatively secure environments, a baseline level of unease persists. In my clinical practice, I have worked with individuals whose addictions have caused significant disruption in their lives. In many cases, substances, including alcohol, were initially used as a way to manage anxiety and fear. Clinically, this is often described as self-medication. It becomes important to understand the underlying stresses driving this addictive behavior, as these unresolved factors frequently act as triggers for relapse. More broadly, many people rely on socially accepted substances or behaviors to manage stress. whether it is caffeine for that stimulation in the morning or alcohol to reduce tension and take the edge off. These patterns highlight how central fear and anxiety are in shaping human coping strategies. Fear and anxiety also have important implications for spiritual life. They narrow one's focus towards threat and self-protection, making prayer, reflection, and discernment more difficult. They can distort thinking, increase impulsivity, and weaken emotional stability. In religious contexts, environments that emphasize punishment, guilt, or fear-based messages may unintentionally intensify these challenges of anxiety. Some contemporary scholarship cautions that fear-based theology can negatively affect both mental health and authentic faith development. Against this backdrop, the message of today's gospel is both realistic and reassuring. Jesus does not deny that we will experience loss, rejection, or hardship. Instead, he reorientates our focus, assuring us that we are known, valued, and not alone. The invitation is not to eliminate fear entirely, but to live with a deeper trust that we are held in God's care and accompanied in our struggles. If you find this podcast helpful, I invite you to join me each week. I also welcome your questions and reflections, and I encourage you to share the podcast with others who may benefit from it. If you are listening on YouTube, you can support the podcast by subscribing and leaving a review. I also would be interested to know where you're listening in from. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome and acknowledge my listeners from Virginia. Thank you for joining. Next Sunday, June 28th, 2026, we will reflect on Matthew chapter 10, verse 37 to 42, where Jesus challenges us to live authentically, to align our lives with what we professed. New episodes are released every Sunday, focusing on the upcoming gospel. Special thanks to Heather Patel-Doherty and Roger Colon for their continued support. And thank you all for joining me today. May God bless you.